So my name is Nicholas, and I'm the director of a program called Radius here at MIT. We're an ethics program, and our mission in looking at science and technology through an ethical lens is to challenge uncritical narratives of progress. And the backstory here, we've been around for about 60 years, and what happened was that some physicists who had left the Manhattan Project in the 40s came to MIT, and when the Vietnam War broke out, they looked around at what was happening and became afraid that their work might be used to perpetuate war crimes, as their work had been a couple of decades previously. So that with the assistance of the Episcopal Chaplaincy at MIT, they created this forum for technology and culture, which has since become named Radius. And these days, you know, when I talk to students, I hear resonances of that history. Because I talk to students who, and all of you professionals as well, whose program, lab, or even whole department is funded by the DoD, the Department of Defense. And so there's some questions here about, okay, what is our work contributing to? Certainly with AI, in fact, here's a story with AI. Initially the idea was to do this event around AI specifically. And we're like, okay, what's the big question in AI that hasn't been asked yet that we should really have a robust debate about? And then it turned out, we were saying, well, you know, actually maybe the real issue, because there's so many people talking about AI right now, the real issue is, let's say that we had a principled objection to some business practice or to some use of some technology that we're developing. How would we even go about voicing our opinion, particularly if it's unpopular? And so there's this desire for something around skill in that regard. And I was just delighted because I have the pleasure of knowing Mary Gentile somewhat through FASB, this ethics fellowship, whose teaching around giving voice to values has impacted me in a significant way as I work with Radius. And so I'm just going to do two quick spiels about Mary and about the person whose name this event bears. One of our generous donors is the family of J. Herbert Holloman, who's an MIT alum, engineer, scholar, scientist, and policymaker, who was also the first Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Science and Technology, appointed to that position by JFK. He founded and directed the Center for Policy Alternatives, which is an interdisciplinary research institute dedicated to the analysis of policy issues involving technology and society. And we have been meeting for these symposia for the last several decades. He passed away in the 80s, so we're grateful to him and to his family for their support of programming like this. And Mary, I will let her introduce herself in giving voice to values, but I'll just say that she is a veteran of Harvard Business School, a pioneer in both ethics and diversity management curricula. And this curriculum that she's going to talk to you about, giving voice to values, has been shared or piloted in over 1,400 educational and executive settings. And glad that Radius can join that list. So thank you, Mary.
Hi, everybody. I'm Mary Gentile. As Nicholas said, I'm really happy to be here. We had a little saga trying to get here, so I'm really happy to be here. I'm going to share with you a little bit about giving voice to values. I hope to spend maybe 35 minutes or so telling you the story of what giving voice to values, or GVV as I refer to it, what it is, a little bit about some of the research that it's based on, why and how it works, where it's used, and then hopefully we can have a conversation after that. So that's kind of the plan. To begin with, I like to tell people that giving voice to values, it's an innovative approach to values-driven leadership development. And I created it originally for use in business schools because, as Nicholas said, I spent 10 years at Harvard Business School, 5 years at Babson College, 6 years at the University of Virginia Darden School of Business. So I've spent most of my professional career in MBA programs. I've shared GVV at the Sloan School, for example, in the past. Although it was created for MBA programs and it's being used in MBA programs, it's now actually grown well beyond that. It's been used in undergraduate, executive education, with corporations, NGOs, the US military. But to begin with, a few days out, I know you're having dinner and it's the end of the day, I'll tell you the bottom line right now. If you don't remember anything else from what I'm going to talk to you about tonight,
this is the sort of headline. Giving voice to values is about asking and answering a different question, a new question when it comes to values-driven leadership, and just acting on our values in our workplaces and in our wider lives. So the typical question that we would ask is, what is the right thing to do in any particular situation? That's a good question. It's an important question. It's not an easy question. It's one that I'm sure you're used to. But giving voice to values is about asking and answering a different question, as Nicholas foreshadowed in his introduction. Instead of asking what is the right thing to do, giving voice to values asks, once you know what you believe the right thing to do is, how can you get it done effectively? What do you need to say and do? Who do you need to speak with? And in what sequence? And what data do you need? And do you need to reframe the challenge in some way? And is this something you're going to do one-on-one, or do you need to build a set of allies, a kind of coalition? And is this a one-off situation, or is this more of a systemic challenge? And if it's a systemic challenge, it needs to be addressed systemically. But too often people use that as a reason to say, therefore, I'm off the hook. But instead, if you look at when and if systemic challenges have ever been addressed, it's still through individual actions. It just means you need to think more incrementally, more long-term, more strategically. So giving voice to values is about asking and answering all of those questions. And so I'm going to take a step back and tell you why I frame it that way. So I guess I like to tell people this all began with what I considered a crisis of faith. I had been working in the field of professional business education for quite a while, and around the late 90s, I had this crisis where I thought, maybe trying to talk about and teach about values and ethics and business was at best futile and at worst hypocritical. And I began to feel that way for a lot of reasons. It seemed that, I'd been working in business schools. It seemed every few years there'd be a spate of scandals that would hit the business press. And if you happened to be working in a leading business school, as I was at the time, we would always be featured. It would often be alumni from our institutions who were on the front pages of the business press as the architects of these various scandals. And so, this was a problem. And so we would usually create some sort of, it's getting darker. We would usually create some sort of task force or committee to consider what's going on, We would interview students and alumni and faculty and recruiters. I was always on the task force. We would look at our curriculum. We would, consider, what is it that we're actually teaching? And as a result of these committees, we would always come up with either a new course, or we might hire some new scholars, create a new research center, send out all the press releases, and then a few years later, the whole cycle would start again. And, I was on this kind of task force multiple times, and it began to feel, as I said, a little bit futile, maybe perhaps a little hypocritical. The second reason for my crisis of faith was perhaps more personal. This was also in the late 90s. I had a friend who ran the ethics program for Stanford Business School. And when he resigned from Stanford, he then went to run something called the Marcellus Center for Professional Ethics at Santa Clara University. And while he was there, he decided to host a debate. And he was going to have two people on one side of the debate who were going to argue that after a quarter of a century of good faith efforts to try and address values and ethics in our educational system, particularly in our business schools, we had made a lot of progress. He asked me to be on that side of the debate. And then on the other side of the debate, he had two people who were going to argue we hadn't made any progress. And on that side of the debate, one of the speakers was Milton Friedman's son, who was also a scholar. So kind of imagine what he might have been talking about. So I sat down to write my remarks for this debate. And I had this moment where I thought, can I lie on an ethics panel? Because, I wasn't really sure what I could say. And so I ended up saying something kind of nuanced, where I said, well, any of us who've been educators or even managers know that there's individuals whom we've had an impact on. But if I were really going to try and speak more broadly, I really couldn't say that we had done so. So that was sort of a watershed moment for me because I'd been doing this for a while, and I thought, gosh, is this really the best I can do? But I think the biggest reason, and the last one I'll mention for my crisis of faith, was something that I would see in the classroom or in lecture settings like this or in corporate settings. And it was this, that whenever I was involved with something where we were going to talk about ethics in our organizational lives, we would usually give people some kind of case study, some sort of thorny ethical dilemma to consider. And people would read that, and then they would come into the conversation, and they would come in with an idea of what they thought the right thing to do might be. But then in the course of the conversation, the discussion, two things would happen. The first thing that would happen is that people's thinking would become more complex. They'd begin to think, well, maybe I didn't really have all the information, or maybe this is kind of standard operating procedure in this part of the world, or in this industry, or in this organization. Or maybe it is wrong, but if I try and do something about it, I'm not likely to be that successful, and I might even make things worse, at least for myself. So their thinking would become more complex. I think that's a good thing. I don't want people to walk into these conversations naively. But the second thing that would happen in these conversations was more troubling to me. I don't know if you have this experience, but I would find that in classrooms or in organizational settings, when we would have conversations, there would usually be a few people that when they spoke, everyone would turn to listen to them. Maybe they were the most articulate people, the people who could express a really complex idea in a clear and pithy way. Or at HBS, they were often the person who always had a witty story to illustrate his or her position. In corporate settings, it was usually the person of the highest rank in the room. I remember speaking at the U.S. Air Force Academy once, and it was, of course, when the general spoke, everybody would listen. But typically, when those people spoke, they were often the ones expressing the most skeptical, if not cynical, positions. They were often the ones who were saying, not always, but often the ones who were saying, Mary, I know what you want me to say, but in the real world, this just isn't possible. This is just too difficult, too complex, it wouldn't work. And so I thought, gosh, the people that everyone is listening to are telling them, you can't do this. So I thought people are walking out of these ethics discussions both more confused and less empowered. And I thought, wow, it's not really the way I want to spend my time, And so I decided, life is short. I want to do something that matters. I'm just going to take a step back from this work. And I did. This was like in the late 90s. So I started doing other things. I thought I've got some other skills. I'll find some things to do. And around that time, I got a consulting gig at Columbia Business School. And while I was there, I was working on a project over here, but there were a group of senior faculty who were working on their own issue. They were still addressing this issue about ethics education in business schools. It was a group of, senior finance, accounting, business government relations, business law, strategy. And so they had come up with this idea. It was their idea, not mine, but they knew what I had done when I was at Harvard working on ethics, and so they asked me if I would take a look at what they were doing. So this is what they were doing. They were asking all of the incoming MBA students at Columbia. This was in the late 90s. I think they may still do this, I'm not sure. But they were asking all of them upon matriculation, during orientation, to answer one question. This was the question. Tell us about a time in your work experience so far when you were explicitly told or implicitly pressured to do something that conflicted with your own values and how you handled it. So, at that time, they had about 600 people in a cohort, and most of them had 2-3 years of work experience already. So they all had to write just a little paragraph about that. They didn't have to put their names on it. It wasn't empirical data. It was self-reporting. But they all just answered this question. So these faculty said, Mary, would you read these? We're trying to figure out what to do with them. So I read hundreds and hundreds of these, well over 1,000 over several years, and they were really interesting. So let me tell you what we learned. The first thing we learned is that I could probably count on one hand the number of folks who said, I was never asked to do something that conflicted with my own values. So the first thing we learned is they pretty much all had a story to tell. The second thing we learned is that, again, if you look at the kinds of people who were getting an MBA at Columbia, it's in New York City, certain industries were more heavily represented. So there were a lot of people from the big consulting firms, there were a lot of people from the financial sector, a good number of people from big pharma, some high tech. So because certain industries were more heavily represented, the kinds of issues they described got repetitious really quickly. So they talked about things like being pressured to inflate or deflate their billable hours in a way that didn't reflect what they really were doing. Or being asked to tamper with or adjust the equations and benchmarks they use to evaluate the relative attractiveness or lack of attractiveness of a particular financial transaction in order to encourage their clients to take the action that would maximize revenue for their own employer. Or they were encouraged to exaggerate, to puff up the capabilities of a new product, a new service, a new piece of software, a new pharmaceutical product, beyond what their data could really establish in order to maximize sales revenues. And then there were always various forms of corruption, being encouraged to pay bribes or facilitating payments in order to gain access to certain markets or to compete effectively for certain RFPs. And then finally, there were always the ubiquitous human resource issues. So fairness, discrimination, hiring, firing issues. So the stories they told got repetitious really quickly. What was interesting is that their responses differed and they fell into several recognizable buckets. So the first bucket, the largest bucket, a little less than half of them said, yes, I had this kind of conflict and it bothered me. It didn't just roll off my back. But I really didn't think I had any options. So I just sucked it up and did what they told me to do. Then the second group was a small group who said, yes, I had this conflict. It bothered me so much I couldn't bring myself to do it. But these folks also didn't think they had any real option. So they tried to remove themselves from the situation. So some of them got themselves transferred to a different work group or a different manager. A few of them even quit their jobs. But this was a small group. So now the rest of the group, we're talking about a third of them, said, yes, I had this conflict. It bothered me and I tried to do something about it. And a small group of them said, I tried and I failed. But about a quarter of the whole group said, I tried, and by my lights, I was successful. So we thought, well, this is kind of interesting. You know, these are all people who got into Columbia Business School. They've got something going for them. They're talking about often the same kinds of struggles, often the same organizations, you know, and some of them were able to do this effectively when so many were not. And you know, we knew it wasn't, like I say, it wasn't, you know, empirical data, but it was interesting and provocative, and we thought, well, maybe we can learn something about how to, a better pedagogy, a better way of developing and teaching people if we understand why some of these folks were able to do this. So we brought in a researcher to kind of slice and dice the stories and look for patterns and themes. And in the end, she couldn't say that one group was more morally troubled than the other group. Because it wasn't like we gave them a situation and you thought it was important, but you didn't think it was such a big deal. We actually asked them to think of a situation that bothered them. So that wasn't the distinction. And it wasn't, you know, that one group was more organizationally sophisticated, you know, politically savvy than the other group. Because in fact, some of the folks who did this effectively did come up with really ingenious kinds of solutions and win-wins. But a few, you know, some of them were just kind of clumsy and naive in the way they did it. So that wasn't the big distinction. So in the end, the only thing that we could say was the people who did this at some point said something outside of their own heads, and it might have started by talking to a spouse or a partner or a friend, but eventually it found its way into the organization and changed the trajectory of things. So when I heard that, I went back to my crisis of faith. It's kind of a identity theme with me, you know, and I thought, well, I was hoping for, you know, this really great insight that was going to help us with education and development, and I really wasn't sure what to do with that. But then I remembered some research that I had seen years earlier when I was still at HBS. It was 2 different studies by 2 different scholars, Douglas Hunneke and Perry London. And they both decided that they wanted to research what they were calling, independently, they wanted to research what they were calling moral conviction. It was qualitative research. They were going to try and find populations of people who had acted on their values in times of high stakes, high risk, and do in-depth interviews and find out, you know, did they have any sort of common background, personal family experiences, religious experiences, you know, whatever. So both of them decided the populations that they were going to interview were people who are often referred to as rescuers from World War II. So these are people who put their own lives at stake during the Holocaust to save others. So they did these interviews, and you know, they came, you know, as is often the case with qualitative research, they came up with a list of features these people tended to share, and I don't really remember most of them. But there was one that really resonated with me, probably because I was an educator, and they said the people who did this effectively, or did this at all said that at an earlier point in their lives, usually as a young adult, they had had the experience with someone more senior to them. So a boss, a professor, a mentor, even a parent. They'd had the experience of rehearsing out loud, what would you do if, and then various kinds of conflicts, moral conflicts. Now, of course, they couldn't have anticipated the Holocaust, but they did have this experience at both the cognitive and the behavioral level. So at the cognitive level, they named the values that mattered to them, and they put a script to it, a kind of articulation, set of words. But at the behavioral level, they had the experience of voicing it out loud to someone more senior to them who was standing in proxy, in a way, for the kind of person they might need to communicate with in the actual circumstances. So I thought, well, this is kind of interesting, this idea of rehearsal, pre-scripting, you know, pre-action planning, peer coaching. So I decided, well, let's do a little more exploration. So I already had all those stories from the Columbia students, but I started interviewing people. I interviewed everyone from people right out of school to C-suite executives, and I asked them that same question from Columbia. You know, tell me about a time when your own values conflicted with something you felt pressured to do and how you handled it. So I gathered lots of stories, both of times when people had been successful and times when they had not. And then I also looked at the research. This was about 15 years ago. There was starting to be a lot of research, there's more now, in a number of disciplines that supported this idea of rehearsal and practice and pre-scripting and peer coaching. So in the field of psychology, there's been a good bit of work on habit formation. You may have read some of the stuff, Charles Duhigg's book on the power of habit, this idea of creating habits and behaviors. There's also a group of folks in psychology who study what they call positive deviance, which is the idea of people who deviate from the norm, but in a positive direction. And they have a nice phrase. This is their phrase, not mine, but I think it helps to communicate what I'm saying. They say if you want to have an impact on people's behavior, rather than asking them to think their way into a different way of acting, it's more effective often to have them act their way into a different way of thinking. So I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. And then there's been research in the field of cognitive neurosciences. That's not my field, but I spoke to knowledgeable folks, and you, I'm sure, are aware of the work on brain plasticity and creating new neural pathways. But the research I want to mention comes from the field of kinesthetics, or the study of physical movement. And I'm just going to share a little story because I think it helps clarify what I'm talking about. Back in the day when I first went to work at Harvard Business School, I decided to take a self-defense class. Now, I had been fortunate in my life. I'd never felt the need for a self-defense class until I went to work at Harvard Business School. Make of that what you will. But so I looked around Boston, and there were a lot of these courses. And they all teach pretty much the same thing. Some of you may have taken one. They teach you the physical moves. So it's, fist to bridge of nose, and heel to instep, and knee to groin. And the idea is you practice these in the air so that then, if anyone ever is coming after you, you know what to do, right? But there was one class that was different. It was called model mugging. And it was a developmental model, so they would still teach you all those moves and you'd practice them in the air. But then once you knew the moves, they'd bring in a gentleman in a padded suit, sort of like the Michelin Man, if you've ever seen those ads. And we would line up and we would take turns getting attacked by this guy. And you could use the moves on him because he was protected. And in the beginning, it was kind of ludicrous because you just stood there waiting your turn to get attacked. But as the class went on, week after week, I might be, over here. He might come and grab me. I would never know when. I would never know what move, what hold he was going to use. So it was utterly nerve-wracking. But the idea, as they explained it to us, was that this was based on something called specific state muscle memory. So it's the idea if you rehearse something in the same physiological and emotional and cognitive state that you'll be in when you need to use it, that even if you freeze in the moment, your body remembers. So, the tennis pro practices her serve over and over before she goes to tournament. So when she's there under all that stress, her body just naturally assumes the proper form. So that was the idea behind it. So one day I'm in this class and I'm lying on my back on the floor because I have failed to protect myself. And I was thinking, could you create a kind of moral muscle memory? Could you create a default to voice, but not just to speaking up? It's not about shaking your fist and speaking truth to power. Because all these people I was interviewing and hearing stories from, the people who did this effectively, it was not about whistleblowing. It was not about going to their boss and telling him or her that they were evil. It was usually much more strategic, much more tactical, much more nuanced. They were using all of those skills of communications and problem reframing and negotiations and power and influence that they were learning in other places, and they were applying them to values issues. What I was seeing so often is that when people confront values issues, it's like they dumb themselves down. It's like, now I have to take the stand and be a martyr and, fall on my sword. And all these things I know about how to build allies and how to, influence people and how to reframe challenges so they see what's in their own interest, et cetera, go out the window. So, I was thinking, could we create this kind of default to voice, but default to informed voice? Because I was also learning that the kinds of objections that people encounter when they want to raise values issues were fairly predictable. They were very powerful, but they weren't bulletproof. It was very difficult to come up with ways to reframe them in the moment. So we identified the ones we heard most often, which are things like, it's not material, it's not a big enough deal, it's standard operating procedure, it's just the way it's done in this industry or this part of the world. It's above your pay grade, it's not your responsibility. Or there's one we call locus of loyalty, which is like, yeah, it may be a little dodgy, but aren't you loyal to your manager, your customers, your colleagues, your company? So, these were powerful, as I say, but they weren't bulletproof, and we were finding ways that people addressed them. But as I said, it's very hard to do that in the moment. So I thought, well, this is really interesting. This idea of rehearsal, pre-scripting, action planning, peer coaching. So then I look back at what we typically do when we try and teach about ethics in professional schools, business schools, engineering, etc. And then I got depressed again, because what we typically do, and I did this, and it's understandable, is we would teach awareness and analysis. Companies do this too. We would expose you to a lot of the kinds of scenarios you might encounter in whatever work you're doing, so you recognize them, so you're aware of them. And then we would teach you models of ethical reasoning. If you were in an academic setting, it was often models of ethical reasoning from philosophy, utilitarianism, deontology, virtue ethics. When you're in a corporate setting, you usually are, you hear about the company's code of conduct, their value statement, the relevant laws and regulations. And then you look at scenarios and you try and decide, is this over the line or not? And the idea is that, then but they stop there. And so these are good things to do, but they're not sufficient, necessary but not sufficient. I think an example of that is a story I told you I interviewed a lot of people. One of the guys I interviewed was a CEO and an entrepreneur. A lot of people told me I should talk to him because he was very thoughtful about values and business. And he told me this story. He said that he had recently been hiring for a high potential position in his company, and his HR department had identified a short list of recent MBA graduates from top business schools in the US, and he was doing the final interviews and was going to decide. And he said he had this gentleman come into his office, and he asked him, "Did you take an ethics class in your MBA program?" And the guy said, "Well, yeah, it was required." And so the CEO said, "Well, what did you learn?" And the guy said, "Well, I learned all the models of ethical reasoning, utilitarianism, deontology, virtue ethics, and then I learned that whenever you encounter a values conflict, you should decide what you want to do, and then select the model of ethical reasoning that will best support what you want to do." Now, this is not what the professor was hoping the guy would walk away with. And the CEO was sort of yanking my chain because I was the ethics lady. But there is a lot of truth to this, right? These models of ethical reasoning conflict. That's actually intentional. What you see from a consequentialist perspective, you wouldn't see from a duty-based perspective. So that's why they're useful. So they don't tell you what's right, they just help you think clearly. And then once you've decided what's right, they certainly don't tell you how to get it done. So I thought, okay, awareness analysis, this is good, but used poorly, it becomes a schooling for sophistry. Students learn to be able, anyone learns to be able to rationalize anything, as that young recruit was demonstrating. So I thought we need to add the third A, or action. We need to have a pedagogy for action. So I thought, well, how do we do that? So when I was at HBS, one of my roles was to hire and train and manage all of the case writers. And you're familiar with case studies, I'm sure. They're 10 or 15 pages long, and they usually end with a CEO who leans back in their chair, looks out the window, and says, "What should I do?" And then people discuss that for 90 minutes. So it's a good way to teach awareness and analysis. It doesn't teach action. It was often, in the last 5 minutes, it's like therapy, in the last 5 minutes you say what's really bothering you. In the last 5 minutes of these case discussions, they'd come up with the answer, and then they'd say, create an action plan, as if that was the easy part. So I thought cases are good, but they need to be tampered with, tweaked. So our cases are short. Sometimes they're just a paragraph or two. Sometimes they're a few pages. They feature people at every level, not just C-suite executives, because what we learned from all those interviews is that people start having these conflicts right away. But the big difference is they're what one dean called post-decision making. The case ends with the protagonist who knows what he or she thinks the right thing to do, and the question is, how could they get it done successfully? What would they need to say and do? What would the pushback be? And then what would they say and do? And all of those other questions I mentioned before. What data do they need? How do they reframe the challenge if they need to? What examples can they draw on? Who do they need to involve, et cetera, et cetera. So that was kind of the way we tweaked it. I never asked, we call it the GVV thought experiment, because we never asked people, what would you do? Because the other thing we were learning from the research, a lot of people doing research in behavioral ethics and behavioral sciences, we're finding out that when we encounter values conflicts, typically we don't sit down and make a pro and con list. We don't sit down and say, what would John Rawls say? Or what would Aristotle say? Or what would Confucius say? We don't do that. Typically we react automatically, emotionally, even unconsciously, and we rationalize post hoc why it was the right thing to do, or why it was the only thing we could do. Now, we don't do this because we're trying to be evil. We do this because it's unconscious. It's part of our self-protective effort to not have to live in a space of cognitive dissonance where you know something's wrong and you do it anyways. And so it's a way that we kind of protect ourselves. So if I ask you, what would you do? I'm just reinforcing that automatic loop. So instead, what I want to do is say, what if? It's the thought experiment. What if you were this person who knows this is what they believe is right? How could they be successful? It's triggering a different way of thinking. It's triggering a different kind of problem solving. One of the things that I found both in MBA classrooms and in corporations was that People don't want to look naive. They don't want to look foolish. They don't want to look like they don't really understand how the world works. And so often there's a kind of what Timothy Snyder at Yale calls anticipatory obedience, right? And so what we're doing is we're giving people permission, even the requirement, to think about if someone wanted to do this, how could they be successful? And doing it in this way also triggers more creativity because I'm not putting you on the spot. I'm saying, what if you were this person who wants to do this? And so the idea here is that we're trying to literally rewire that connection so that when you encounter situations like this, you have more arrows in your quiver. You have more ideas of what might be possible. You've looked at positive examples. Because we created hundreds of pieces of material, all based on real situations, pretty much all disguised, talking about how people encounter these issues and what they do and how they tried. We usually try and feature people who were successful. We have a B case. Sometimes people failed, but then the B case is, well, what could they have done that might have been more successful? And we had a protocol of questions, and we worked people through. We can go into that if you're interested. So we created all this material. There's cases, there's exercises, there's the core book that I wrote, but then there's a whole book series that applies this to different issues, whether it's sustainability, whether it's the law, whether it's corporate governance, et cetera, et cetera. And there's MOOCs and online modules. We put all this stuff out there. We made much of it available for free, and we invited people to experiment with it. And frankly, I was kind of surprised at the range and rapidity of the take-up. As I said before, it's been used all over the world in lots of different contexts. But I'm going to wrap up now so we can have some discussion. But what I want to conclude with is saying that you've probably figured out that GBV is just a reframe. Instead of asking what's right, we ask, how do you get the right thing done? And I like to tell people it's based on the 3 giving voice to values reversals, or the 3 flips. So we've reversed what it is we're talking about when we talk about ethics and values in organizations. We've reversed who we think we're talking to, and we've reversed how we have the conversation. So in terms of what it is we're talking about, used to be, if people asked me what I did for a living, I would lie. I lie a lot for someone who does ethics, but if I said I did ethics and business ethics, I'd get a lot of bad jokes. It's an oxymoron, people would, it was not fun. So I'd just say, oh, I teach leadership or something. But as time has gone on, I've actually started to think about this differently. People would often say to me, if you want to talk about ethics in business, don't focus on the so-called black and white, clear-cut, right, wrong kinds of issues. Focus on the gray issues, because those are the tough ones. And I used to think, yeah, that makes sense. But I've actually changed my mind. There are a lot of gray issues, and I don't know what the right answer is to all those issues. But those are typically issues where reasonable people of goodwill and intelligence can legitimately disagree. That's why they're gray. But nevertheless, there are a lot of issues where most of us, not everybody, but most of us would agree, well, that's clearly over the line. It's clearly fraudulent or illegal or abusive. But just because most of us might agree to that, it doesn't mean that we feel like we can be effective at voicing that or acting on that or having that kind of impact. So we've decided, let's focus on the so-called clear-cut issues. If we focus on the gray issues, you never get past the conversation about how many angels dance on the head of a pin. It's always the debate. I want to get to action planning. So we try and focus on more clear-cut issues so we can get to action planning and scripting. And what we're learning from that is that once you do that, you get better at talking about the gray issues too. You also find out that a lot of issues that you might have considered gray are not so gray, but it was this self-protective measure because you didn't think it was possible to do anything else, so our brain tells us it's not as clear as it is. So that's the first flip. We try and focus on those issues. The second thing is we've reversed who we think we're talking to. So usually when I go into an organization or a classroom, they'll say, most of the people here are good people. There's just a few bad apples. But I actually think of the audience differently, and this is based on some research by the late Greg Dees and Peter Crampton, who worked on ethics and negotiations. So we think about the organization as a bell curve. And at one tail end of the bell curve are the folks who would self-identify as opportunists. And we would define opportunists as people who would say, I would like to act on my values as long as it doesn't put me, I will always act in a way that maximizes my personal self-interest, regardless of values, okay? Now, nobody falls into one of these categories all the time, but these are people who, if they were being honest, would say, you know, my motivation is my own material self-interest, regardless of values. And at the other tail end of the bell curve are the folks who would self-identify as idealists. And these are the ones who would say, I would like to act on my values. I always try and act on my values, regardless of the impact on my self-interest. What we premise is that the majority of us fall under the bell. I put myself there. We call them pragmatists. And we define pragmatists as people who say, I would like to act on my values as long as it doesn't put me at a systematic disadvantage. Now, that's not the same as saying, as long as I know I'll succeed. It's not the same as saying, as long as I know I'll never pay a price. It simply means, I'd like to do it as long as I think I have a shot. Now, if you see your audience that way, I don't really think I have the power to change the opportunists. I think some of them will always be with us. And I'm not so worried about the idealists, except I would like them to be more skillful and more competent at this. I have some stories about that. But we're really focusing on the pragmatists, and we want to give you the literal scripts. We want to give you the action plans. We want to give you the positive examples. We want to give you the rehearsal, the pre-scripting, the peer coaching, to be who you already want to be at your best. We're not trying to change you. We're trying to enable you, to empower you. I learned this when I was in the business school settings because we presented ethics always as constraints on action. And, you know, people who go to business school, people who, you know, study engineering and technology, you know, are motivated by wanting to build things, wanting to create things, wanting to solve problems, wanting to build enterprises, wanting to make money. And if you present everything as a constraint on action, it's not all that appealing. So what we're trying to do is to present this as more aspirational. It's giving you an opportunity to be able to do what you want to do, but in a way that is consistent with your own values. So we reframed it a little bit in that way. And our theory or our premise is that if enough of the pragmatists and the idealists become more skillful at this and more likely to do this, it changes the water that the opportunists are swimming in. So they can no longer rely, the calculus that they use to determine what's in their self-interest has to change because they can no longer rely on the same level of silent complicity from everybody else. So that's how we flipped who it is we're talking to. And then finally, we flipped how we have the conversation, and I already told you that. Instead of focusing on what's the right thing to do, we focus on how do you get the right thing done. So that's GVV in a nutshell. I'm going to stop there, and I'm happy to share with you if you want to hear about some of our experiences with companies or other organizations, or if you have questions about the premises behind it. But mostly I just want to thank you for listening because I enjoy the opportunity to share the story of GVV. So thanks. So any questions? Yeah.
I'm curious if you ever used any exercises from Theater of the Oppressed?
That's really interesting. I have not explicitly used them. So the way we typically, people use GVV in different ways, but the way we typically share the experiences that we'll have scenarios, these post-decision-making scenarios. We'll have people read them. We have a protocol of questions we invite them to think through individually. Then we bring them into small groups, and they share their answers to these questions, which help them come up with a script and action plan together. And then we bring them into the large group, and the small group will present their solution with the script and the action plan and what kinds of objections they think they'll encounter. We call those the reasons and rationalizations, and then what they would say. And then we invite the rest of the groups to peer coach, say, you know, what was good about that, what might you make better, you know. So everyone's working together. People who've worked in other small groups on the same case may have different or better strategies, and they share them. So there is this piece of voicing, but it's not quite as physical and as theater of the oppressed. But it's related, I guess I would say. Yeah. So the reason I said I had a story about idealists was because early in the development of GBV, I remember I was giving a talk. Oh, it was a public talk, so it wasn't just an academic setting. And it was a large group, right? And while I'm talking, I see this woman in the back of the room, and her face is getting redder. Oh, I should have repeated the question. She wanted to know what my story was about idealists. And so I saw her face getting redder and redder as I was speaking, and I was thinking, oh, this is going to be a problem. And so as soon as I finished speaking, like I just did, I said, are there any questions or suggestions or comments? And her hand shot up. So I called on her, and she said, well, I think this is stupid. And I said, okay, can you say a little more? And she said, I don't need giving voice to values. She said, I always voice my values. And then she paused, and she said, no one ever listens, but I always voice my values. So, it was a great opening, because I could say, look, I'm glad you do, and this is not about casting any negative light on that. But what this is about is actually hopefully helping you to be more skillful, more likely to be successful and effective. So it's not that the impulse of an idealist is anything to sneer at. It's a wonderful thing. But I think that idealists can also get better at expressing these things in a way that's more likely to be effective. Thanks for asking. Other comments or questions or suggestions? Yeah. What do you do when people don't have that luxury, is that fair, to feel like they don't have anything to lose? So I would say that's actually what I hoped GVV would be all about. Because often people will hear giving voice to values, or even just ethics, and they think it's about blowing the whistle. They think it's about reporting, falling on your sword, taking this huge risk. And one of the motivations for me to create GVV was that was looking at the research, and there's research out there about whistleblowers. And the thing is, it's not a pretty story, It's not good for the organization, because it's usually gotten pretty far down the road before someone blows the whistle. It's not good for whoever was the victim of whatever the action is that you're trying to stop, because it's also gotten pretty far down the road. And it's also not a good story for the whistleblowers themselves, because they often end up feeling ostracized, or feeling retaliated against, or just feeling like it hurts them in some way in their organizations and in their careers. And so I see giving voice to values as not about whistleblowing. It's about helping people to raise these issues before it gets to the point where whistleblowing is your only option. I mean, sometimes it's necessary, lives are at stake or time is short. But this is really about trying to change the conversation within the organization before you get to that point, which means that the stakes are lower in general, although often because of that tendency toward anticipatory obedience, we think the stakes are higher. And also, it's hopefully going to protect the organization from getting to that point where the stakes are that high. And so that's really how we've tried to reframe this. I can give you an example. When I was I never thought this was going to be used in companies, but when I created it for business schools, I remember this was like over 10 years ago now. The first company to ever use GVV was Lockheed Martin, the defense contractor. And they reached out to me, or one of their executives reached out to me and asked me to have lunch, and we were talking, and they had an award-winning ethics program at the time, because they had been required to develop an ethics program after the defense industry scandals in the 70s, I guess it was. But they were, as this executive was explaining to me, our program, which was all based on videos, is all about helping people recognize, where are the issues, And she said, what I'm interested in with GVV is that, well, then what do they do once they've recognized it? Do they just go report it, which can have some of the challenges that you're talking about? And so that was really what attracted her. But on the other hand, Lockheed Martin is a defense contractor, so they have mandatory reporting to the government if there's an issue. And so there was some concern about, is GVV short-circuiting that process? And so one of the things that we really talked about is that it was hopefully starting this conversation before actions were taken that required you, that flipped the switch, that required you to report some sort of transgression. And since they've been using GBV now for over a decade, and they do, every 2 years I think it is, they do employee surveys, and they started building in questions about GBV. They call it VOV there, they call it voicing our values. And what they tell me that they find is that people report that they do see issues that they think are problematic, and that they do bring them to their ethics officers, but more often they're bringing them and saying, I want to address this before it gets to that problematic stage, but can I work with you to figure out the best way for me to frame this and the best way to voice my values? So from the ethics officer's perspective, they were hearing about issues that could be problematic, but people were wanting to take action themselves, which was more a form of true culture change, And so that's really what we're trying to do with GVV. We're trying to help people develop an approach that mitigates the risk that someone who wasn't in the privileged position you were talking about might take. So, I always tell people, this isn't easy, and it's not always going to be possible, but it's important, and you can get better at it. And what GVV is about is building that skill, that moral muscle memory. So what she's asking is the story I told about Columbia and the students who, and it wasn't really a survey, like I say, it wasn't really empirical data, it was self-reporting stories, but she was kind of saying, maybe this is a stereotype, but are people at business schools more likely to be kind of interested in self-interest, I think is what you're saying. Is that right? And so is that a kind of biased result? It might be, but on the other hand, the exercise that we had them do, or that those faculty had the students do, was to talk about a situation that bothered them. So we weren't talking about any ethical infraction. It was something that felt like it violated their values. And so they all came up with examples of something, well, like I said, there was maybe on one hand people who didn't, but almost all of them came up with examples of something that did violate their values. And the idea here is that we were trying to build their sense of efficacy. You know how when you give a talk and at the end of the talk people will say, well, what's the one thing you want people to remember? And I would often say, well, I want people to feel like in these sorts of situations they have more choices than they think they did. And so I think that what I found, and again, this is a generalization, stereotype, not data-based, but what I found working with business school students is, they're really success-oriented. And so there is a lot of that anticipatory obedience, this fear of sticking out. They want to stick out in terms of, I'm a go-getter and I'm, this and that. But in terms of pushing against the prevailing winds, they may not. But then I started working with other professions, going into work with law students or lawyers, going into work with engineering students. I did a program at Olin College of Engineering, We recently did a project where we looked at tech ethics issues. And we find the same thing because all of these people are working, almost all of them are working in a business setting. And so the same pressures that are on you as a business student or a young business professional are on you working in a business as a young engineer or a young programmer or someone working in a healthcare setting. We started working with folks in hospitals, and there's all these issues about, what do they call it, mission versus margin. Everybody who's working in any kind of organization has those kinds of pressures on them. So maybe you could say I guess what I would say is there's probably a greater acceptance of certain kinds of behaviors in some professions, but I don't think it's necessarily inherent in the individuals. And so what we're probably trying to do is to get them to find that part of themselves, that aspirational part of themselves. I don't know. I don't really have data for that, but that's how I framed that. If you're not in a business school and you're working with a group of young professionals who don't necessarily have a lot of background on organizational structures and processes, don't really necessarily know how they work and where the levers are, how could you help them in terms of teaching? So we use the same approach in the sense of the post-decision making cases, But when you're working with a group of people who maybe aren't as familiar with how organizations work, I think it's really important to choose some examples where there's a B case where someone was really effective at knowing who to speak with first, how to frame the challenge, what were some of the what were the risks involved, the stakes involved for all the people you're trying to influence, because you can use that as a teaching case, so you sort of build it up. If you were to do that, reach out to me and I'd be happy to point you to some that I think would be good examples. We do have a protocol of questions that questions we have people work through on any case. The first question is simply to ask people to state what's the values-based position that the protagonist wants to take, so you make sure everyone's arguing on the same page, because the tendency with the GVV case is for people to revert to do the default ethics kind of case where they'll start debating whether it was really wrong. So I just say, for the sake of this, this is what this is what the person has decided. The second question we ask, and this gets partly to what you're talking about, is what's at risk for all the affected parties? And that's not to do a stakeholder analysis, because the person in the case has already decided what they think is right. It's rather to understand, what are the people I'm trying to influence afraid of? What are they aspiring to? Where are they within the organization? Who do they have pressure from? So that kind of starts to identify some of those organizational pressures. And then the third question we ask is, what are, in GVV parlance, we call them reasons and rationalizations, but what are the objections you're likely to encounter if you try and raise this issue? I mentioned some of them before, it's not material, it's standard operating procedure, et cetera. There may be others. We ask people to identify those and then to begin to think about how they might respond to them. We have examples of ways to respond to all of those. And then finally, the fourth question is, given all of that, what do you think would be an effective strategy and action plan? We have a whole list in the book, we have a whole list of what we call enablers, which are different tactics that you can use depending on where you are in the organization. We have examples of people who do this when they were right out of school, right out of a BA even, and people who did it when they were a senior executive, because it's very different because of what you've pointed out, the organizational realities. So I think I would start with some of the case examples that have really clever ways that people did it, and then work up through some of the others. It's a great question. She was asking about my experience with corporations and how many of them are really serious about values. When is it just window dressing, right? So it varies widely. There are some organizations that have come to me because they got in trouble and they need to do something different. There are some organizations that come to me because they actually are attracted to the GVV framework because they see it as more action-oriented. Some companies will say, well, I like this because it's not just about ethics, it's about leadership. It's about, leaders have to often, whether they're formal leaders or informal leaders, often have to figure out how to communicate something that isn't necessarily immediately attractive. And so I've had companies come to me for a lot of those different kinds of reasons. And then we've done very different things with them. So I mentioned Lockheed, who initially got into this because they were in trouble. By the time they came to me, they had upped their game sufficiently or dramatically in terms of how they were being viewed, but they wanted to keep enhancing it, and so that was cool. I did some work with Unilever, who was also really committed to these issues, but they asked me to work with some of their organizations in developing countries. And so they then had and it was from their leadership group, not their ethics group. So their leadership group came to me and said, we're going to ask whether any of the country managers in developing countries are interested in trying to pilot this. So they put out the call, and there was this very forward-thinking country manager in Nigeria who said, I'll be the test case. And so we went down to Lagos and we spent some time interviewing people and doing focus groups and trying to identify what are the relevant issues for Unilever in this context. And then we designed a training program that we came back and delivered for middle managers there who had been selected, high potentials, who would then deliver it to the rest of the organization. So in that case, they were actually trying to get out ahead of things. I'm actually working with the MasterCard Foundation now, also in Africa, again, around some of these issues. And more recently, we've been working with KPMG. KPMG got into some trouble because they, if you're a certified public accountant, you have to be licensed and you have to do continuing education and all this stuff. And apparently, there'd been some cheating on the test, and they got caught. And so they were required to put something in place to address this. So in their case, it was, this was public. I'm not telling things that aren't known. But they actually did, this was during COVID, so they reached out to a number of people. So they reached out to, I don't know if you know Dan Ariely, who does this work on, he did a web training on, lying and honesty and dishonesty. And they asked me to do a web training on GVV. So I did. And it kind of caught interest. So then they asked me, we want to build on this. So what we did, I suggested that they find some senior leaders who had been successful in the firm, had come up through the firm, who had stories to tell about pressures they encountered when they were more junior, and how they acted on their values and how they learned how to do it. And so we coached them on these stories. We called them learning stories, and developed another web-based training and then an exercise. And that kind of caught interest. So then what they did is they asked me to work with them to create a course. I think they call it the KPMG GVV Master Facilitators. And what we did is we developed a course. We've run it 3 times now. I think we're going to run it again soon, where senior managers and partners volunteer to be part of this course. And we teach them the GVV method. They get to practice with it. Then we work with them. They write a GVV-style scenario, post-decision-making scenario, based on what they have either experienced or witnessed in their area, whether it's audit, tax, consulting, operations, and a solution. And then we have them teach it to each other, and I coach them on how you lead this, how you facilitate this. And then if they complete this, then now they have a library of these post-decision-making GVV scenarios. And then the folks who completed this course, then they plant them in, let's say you're doing continuing education if you work in the tax area. They'll throw in a GVV-style case into that. So it's not like a separate ethics case. It's the tax program or it's the audit program, but we'll throw in some values-related GVV-style scenarios, and they will come in and lead those. So that's another way to do it. So companies have done it in very many ways. I try and adapt it to what works in the context I'm in. I'll just add 2 small stories. One is that there was a woman, I was teaching in a PhD program in the Midwest. I was a guest teacher on GVV, and there was a woman there who worked at Boeing. And she liked GVV, and so she came to one of my training programs and with some of her colleagues, and then she pitched at Boeing that they would do a pilot on GVV. And she did. And at the end, Boeing decided, no, we're going to go with, it was some consulting firm that did neuroscience and ethics or something. And so apparently it didn't work, and I guess I feel like I dodged a bullet. So I'm kind of glad I wasn't working there when all of this happened. So will GVV change the world? That's my goal. I don't know. I'm not, audacious enough to claim that. But what I do know is that I share this all over the world, and I hear from people all the time who have found ways to have it work for them. So I feel like, well, I don't know if I'm going to change the world, but I do think that there are individuals who are empowered because of this. I think there's organizations who are empowered because of this. Organizations that I've shared this with, I hear back later that they're still using that language within the organization. I don't claim that it's going to have the impact you're talking about, but the other thing is that I don't know if I totally believe those kinds of studies. I mean, I think that, yes, there are tendencies. In fact, there's some research that suggests that the higher you get in an organization, the more you drink your own Kool-Aid, the more you believe that you're always right. So it's not even just about being more dishonest, it's that you think you're honest because you've been rewarded for the way you've acted. And so I think that part of that is sharing these kinds of stories. GVV is really story-based. The other thing is that when I was interviewing people, when I interviewed people very young in an organization, they would say, I would like to act on my values, but I'm new, I don't have a lot of authority, any authority, I don't have a network, I don't have the legitimacy or the knowledge. It's really risky for me. When I get to be more senior, I'll be able to do this. And then I would talk to people who were in the C-suite, you know, CEOs and CFOs, et cetera, and they would say, of course I would like to act on my values, but you know, I have a lot of people relying on me, investors, customers, employees, communities. It's very risky for me. If I were lower in the organization, it'd be easier. And then I talk to people in the middle who would say, I'm getting squeezed from both sides. Now, none of them were lying. They were all telling the truth. But nevertheless, I found people at every level, from the very junior to the very senior, who did do this effectively. They just did it very differently, because they had different levers they could pull. They had different, you know, risk profiles, different degrees of freedom. So that's my goal, is to empower people. I don't know whether it's going to change, you know, a whole class of people, but I hope so. So it's the best I can do.
There's always more. We could talk for hours more. I know that if we had an extra 20 minutes, which we don't, but I would be curious, and so this is a little bit of an invitation to all of you. Earlier, Mary, you mentioned some of the forms that opposition can take. This is above your pay grade. This is just the way things are done around here. Can't you just be loyal? And in part, if you're kind of curious about, okay, well, what is the response to opposition like that, each of those specific cases? I'll plug Mary's book, Giving Voice to Values. It's got a red cover if you're looking for it on an online bookseller or something. It's very good. It's kind of a handy pocket reference for me with some of these things. But to the point that it's not just cognitive, but that it's something that we flesh out as a community. Radius, the program under whose auspices we're here, is really looking to experiment next year with gathering groups of people who are interested in ethics or have ethical questions, interested in leadership, or challenging those uncritical narratives of progress, and actually hashing some of these questions out. What are the very real questions that we have in each of our workplaces? Maybe we've heard some version of this message before, and can we work together with our script and embody a response to those kinds of things? So, you know, historically, Radius has had a lot of public programming like this, and that's the kind of main feature, but then we're looking to follow up events like this one with opportunities to really enflesh what we're talking about. So it's a way of saying, if you're curious about that kind of question or anything else Mary mentioned, please read her book and take your copy of her book with you and come back next year. So we'll send an email to everyone who had registered for tonight, and if you didn't register, but you'd like to be on that follow-up email, please just check in with my colleague Christina in the back, and we'll make sure we get your email address, bless you. And then you'll hear more about ways to follow up when we reconvene next year, and hope that many of you will join us, both those of you who are MIT affiliated and those of you who aren't. You're welcome as well. Thank you all for being here, for your great questions, and can we have one more round of applause, please, for Mary?